Welcome back to the Anti-Meta Meta Club. This week's race C is Deep Forest Group 3, and Deep Forest is pretty much two long straights and then a twisty middle section, and because of that, the GT40 is giving everyone lots of problems. Everyone that's not driving a GT40, that is. And because of that, we've got a really strange anti-meta car and an even stranger anti-meta strategy. So let's get into it. With how dominant the Ford GT is, we had to do something kind of drastic in order to find an anti-meta car. The Roofless, as we like to affectionately call it, is actually not that fast by itself when it comes to race pace. However, due to its incredible straight line speed, it can both fend off an attack from a GT40 as well as pass one on the straights. It's very difficult to pull off a move in the middle sector unless the driver you're fighting makes a really big mistake, so it's all about the straights, and the VGT is one of the very few cars that can do absolutely anything against the GT40. Taking just even a glance at the leaderboard shows that the Ford GT LM race car Spec 2 is absolutely the meta car. Many of the cars can easily get into the 24s and even into the mid 24s, but I was just barely able to crack into the 24s with the VGT. Like I said before, it's one of the few cars that can do anything against the Ford GT in the straights, and I do realize I called it the GT40. I'm probably going to jump back and forth like that because I am very old and stuck in my ways. The front straight is very long, so it's really easy to get complacent, so make sure you're looking for these boards. The 100 meter board is where you're going to brake, and you're going to start turning in and trail braking really heavily at the 50 meter board. Aim for the lighter patch of concrete and make sure you're still using lots and lots of brakes until you get to the apex, turn in a little bit more, and then upshift to 4th gear for good traction coming out of the corner. You want to ride the inside curb. As you can see, I completely missed it, so I probably lost about a half-tenth there. Make sure you come off the curb and turn in right about the 50 meter board. Now, I like to go all the way on the grass, but if you're turning too much, it's going to pull you towards that wall. Start turning into the next corner when you pass this sign. As you're turning in, you'll probably feel the front tire stop being as responsive. That's when you want to lift off just briefly and gently, and then get back on the throttle, continuing to turn in. When you feel the car is settled again, that's when we're going to turn in, dab the brakes, downshift, and we're going to look for these weird little bumps on the inside. You want to avoid these little speed bumps as much as you can. If you're lucky, you can sometimes hit them and be okay, but most of the time they're going to make your car jump. When you get to the end of this light piece of concrete on the left, that's when we're going to turn in, dab the brakes, downshift, and as we turn in, we're going to try to avoid that grass. You can hit it a little bit, but if you go really over it, then it's going to make your car slide. Stay in third and use all that concrete up to the wall, but make sure you're coming off of that curbing before you get to that grass. Downshift to second, use the compression braking to slow the car down, as well as just dabbing the brakes to scrub off a little bit of speed, and look for this chevron here on the end. That's approximately where you want to apex. Back up to 4th gear, gently squeeze on the throttle until you can see your exit, and then get fully on that throttle, making sure you don't go all the way over that white line. Continue steering to the left just so we can get a good angle, turning right a little bit to go over this curb, and when you get fully over the curb, that's when we're going to downshift, get on the brakes, and be careful to trail brake as it goes downhill, then get back on the throttle, pushing ourselves all the way wide to the outside of this bridge right here. When you're about halfway across the bridge, that's when we're going to brake really hard, downshift, and you're going to try to get just your inside tires as far as you can on the curb without touching the grass, then all the way up to 4th gear and gently squeeze on that throttle, making sure you don't lose any traction because that will cost you a lot of time at the end. You can push as wide as the outside of the red and white part of the curb, but if you go all the way under the green, you're going to get a penalty. This is a good time to point out the fact that the optimal shift point is approximately 75% of the digital tach, or about 6750 RPM. You're going to be going about 160 miles per hour all the way down to 1st gear, so make sure you get really heavily on those brakes. It's about 2 or 3 feet before the curbing starts here on the right. We want to downshift all the way to 1st gear. We're going to turn in, continue trail braking, but then we're going to get completely off the brakes for our last little bit of turn in. I lost a little bit of time because once again I missed this apex, but it's not too bad. You want to be in 3rd gear before you get on the throttle, and just a note, if you get on the throttle really early and there's a little bit of oversteer, it's oftentimes going to be better than waiting too long to get on the throttle and not having any kind of drama on your exit. Finally, hug these little kinks right here. If you go wide to try to take like a traditional line for those as a corner, it's not going to work. You're just going to slow yourself down. Let's go over at full speed. This car is going to be going a lot faster than most of the Group 3 cars by the time you come to T1, but you don't have to brake too much earlier because the car does have really good brakes. As you can see, I missed the apex. You can go all the way up on that inside curbing. As long as you don't touch the grass, there won't be any drama. This, however, is a different story. As long as you don't add too much steering, there won't be drama, but you should probably avoid it unless you're really confident. The S's here are all about just maintaining your momentum and getting a good rhythm, and this corner right here is all about the exit. Use the chevrons on the outside to make sure you know exactly when you should apex. You can experiment with the attack angle when you come over that curb right there, but you do want to hug the inside and get on the throttle really early, taking note that it is a downhill corner. Do whatever you can to avoid sliding on this left-hander because it's such a long straight that any mistake at the beginning is going to be magnified by the time you get to the end. And like I said, in this part of the breakdown, you want to shift at about 75% of the digital tach, which is about 6750 on the actual tachometer. If you find yourself braking at a similar part here but still missing the turn-in, it's probably because you're turning in too early. Wait until you're at the very least in second gear before you start turning in whatsoever, and continue braking until you're absolutely certain that you've got enough grip in the front tires that you can come off the brakes for that final bit of turn-in. And of course, hug these kinks. You do not need to take a wide line there. All it's going to do is slow you down and make you travel an extra distance. There you go. If you've been following this series for a while, then you've probably heard me complain about how difficult it can be getting a clean race, just so I can show you guys what the optimal strategy would be for using the anti-meta car in the race. This week, it wasn't so much the difficulty of getting good race footage as much as it was the difficulty of even finding what the anti-meta car should be. I like to have these videos out by Wednesday morning, and this race that you're seeing right here was actually Wednesday evening. I didn't even finish the lap until just a couple hours ago, and it is 4:15 a.m. on Thursday morning. But I digress. This race has one of those really interesting strategies. Some of the cars do require, well, not necessarily require, it's a really good idea to take tires for a lot of these cars, especially the MR cars or any of the cars that have a lot of power and a lot of weight. Any other car, however, does not need tires, and that saves you a few seconds in the pit, and as you know, that could be the difference between winning and fourth place, or even worse. The only actual requirement for this race is a single pit stop, and that doesn't mean that you have to take anything during the pits. It just means you have to essentially drive through the pits, and if you're a fan of rallycross, you can consider it like a glorified Joker lap. If you're starting at the front, the best thing to do is just try to get away as fast as you can and then take the pit towards the end. You can also take it before the other people who are around you would take it, so you can get a little bit of clean air and effectively try to do an undercut. Since we're starting towards the back, essentially what we want to do is pit in as soon as we possibly can. Now, of course, there are caveats to that. Let's say all four of the people that we see directly in front of us pit in right at the very first instance that you can. That would be a good chance to just pass that up, because then you get a little bit of clean air. They'd all have to worry about fighting each other, and you might actually be able to make an overcut strategy work over them. You can then pit on the next opportunity, and hopefully you'll have clean air then. The main thing here is just trying to get clean air. You can definitely get the benefit of slipstream on these long straights, but a lot of times the downside is having a lot of dirty air for the rest of the lap. And so it's kind of a balancing act. It really depends on the car. It depends on the people you're racing with, if you know them. And yeah, there's just a lot of stuff to consider. But essentially, if you're at the back, pit early. If you're at the front, pit late. I actually knew all of the people directly in front of me as well as the people behind me, and I was also confident that they would be quick enough that we wouldn't slow each other down. So I was going to go in the pits no matter what. Taking no tires and no fuel, we came out right behind Damien, who was behind Speederman Charles, who was behind Eves, and I trust all three of those guys. Directly after T1, essentially all the way to the back straight, is just a flowy, twisty section. Better handling cars definitely have a huge advantage here, but even the best handling car versus the worst handling car is going to have a really tough time passing anyone in this sector unless the person in front makes a really massive mistake. We don't want to rely on mistakes as part of the strategy, because that can happen to anyone, and anyone behind a mistake can take advantage of that. It doesn't have to be a specific type of car to take advantage of someone in front of you making a mistake. It does, however, take a very specific type of car to be able to do anything against the Ford GT. There are a handful of cars that can keep up with a Ford GT if they're able to stay close enough within the slipstream. However, when those cars no longer have that slipstream, it's going to be really obvious how much of a benefit that slipstream was. It took us a full lap just to catch up to Damien here, and now we're about 3/10 behind him going into the front straight. I was within his slipstream, but he had slipstream from the Ford GT, and I believe it was a Genesis that the other driver was in. But without any slipstream helping him in the front, this is how quickly I was able to get in front of him, hitting 166 by the start-finish line. Grumpy Pants had waited an extra lap to go into the pits, and as you can see, the undercut that I pulled off was immensely powerful. He probably had a little bit of traffic, and so I was able to get in front of him just based on pit timing alone. Damien, as you know, is one of the fastest drivers in the world, and he's definitely one of the fastest controller drivers in the world. If you didn't know, he is on the DS5. He is a controller player, which is phenomenal. Good job, Damien. You're amazing. As you can see in the middle section, he has absolutely no problem keeping up with me, but I want you to see how difficult it is for him to do anything once we get on the straights. I have to admit, for most of this race, I was not driving very well. My pace in the VW was not very good in general, and I really hadn't figured out how to drive it to the best of its abilities yet. When I passed him coming out of the final corner, going onto the front straight on the last lap, I was about 3/10 behind him. He was about 3/10 behind me going onto the back straight, and by the end of it, he's still more than a tenth away from me. Like I mentioned before, I was driving pretty terribly, and yeah, I was understeering really bad, turning in too early, crabbing a little bit going into that corner. I missed the apex, had a terrible exit, and still we're already 4/10 out of that corner ahead of Damien. I want you to take note that we were also starting in 14th place, and the person who just went into the pits started about one position behind us. I believe they also went into the pits 2 laps after us, and I think they definitely had to worry about traffic, which we didn't, and so once again, it's showing the power of the undercut. With Damien not able to do much on the straights, but as you can see, he's still able to get close. He didn't bother trying to make pass attempts because if we work together here, he could potentially try to make a big move towards the end. And since we worked together so well, we were able to pass even more people until we encountered Raphael in the Ford GT. This was the moment we were looking for to really show what this car can do against a Ford GT. As you can see, there's really no issue keeping up with the Ford GT. It has better grip coming out of some corners. It's definitely faster, of course, in the straight line, as we know. And even if I am a little bit quicker through the middle section, it doesn't really matter because I'd have to be drastically faster to make any kind of move happen because it's really just flowy and there are not a lot of passing opportunities. Luckily for me, however, he outbraked himself going into this corner, so I was able to get a much better exit. This moment right here is going to be a perfect example of why I chose the VGT as our anti-meta car. As you can see, of course I got a better exit, but I'm still able to continue accelerating and out-accelerating the GT40 until the very end of this straight when he starts catching up just a little bit. Damien, using my slipstream, is able to go slightly faster than him. Not quite fast enough to make a move, but if he was just following that car rather than me, he wouldn't be able to make a pass on it because he would just barely be able to get maybe a nose in front, and the instant he pulled out of that slipstream, he would no longer be able to go faster. This is a little bit of extra strategy that not everyone's going to be able to employ, but if you do have friends racing with you, they can obviously bump draft you, and you can give them a slipstream instead of your opponents. Obviously, it's not going to work for everyone because not everyone has friends, but if you do, make sure you know that you can work with each other. Now, as you can see from that last corner, I completely overshot and outbraked myself, but because of how nimble this car is and how much grip it has on exits, I was able to essentially turn that corner into a V, get back on that throttle, and get all the way out of there with a better exit speed than that Ford GT could, despite making a massive mistake. It's worth noting, like always, that because of the nature of the middle sector and of course the nature of dirty air, unless someone in front makes a really massive mistake, the people behind are not going to be able to do anything regardless of the different cars that are being used. This straight isn't going to be the best example of what the VGT can do against the GT on the straight because Raphael did make a bit of a mistake. It wasn't terrible, but it was enough of a mistake to really kill his momentum going into the straight. So this, again, isn't a great example of what's going to happen on every single straight with the VGT versus the Ford GT. Now, I mentioned this in passing a little bit before, but the VGT has really good brakes, and the Ford GT, while not having bad brakes, does not have the same braking ability as the VGT, so you can always count on outbraking one of those guys if one of them is chasing you. This is always the case, of course, but if you can continue out driving a person in a Ford GT, then there's not much they're going to be able to do to you, even in the straights, because this is exactly why we chose the VGT. He's not able to catch up until we're at the very end of the straight, and he's nowhere near being close enough to pull off a pass. Jumping to the end lap, you can see it's essentially a stalemate between myself and Raphael. I'm not quite sure if the Ford GT can handle really good lap times all the way through the end of the race, but even if it can't, it's good for the same reason that the VGT is good. If you get the slipstream, then it's going to be so incredibly powerful and so slippery through that air that it's going to be able to pass almost anything, even if it's pretty far behind, the VGT being one notable exception. One of the weaknesses that we didn't actually talk about with the VGT is the tire wear, and it does not treat the tires very nicely. Luckily, when it gets squirrely, it's pretty easy to bring back in a line, but using -4 brake balance to push the brake bias all the way up towards the front does help preserve the tires just a little bit, but you have to be careful not to understeer, because understeer begets oversteer, and sliding in general is just a bad idea for the tires. If you look at the Delta, you can see that I am very slowly catching up to GT7 player, but I didn't have enough of a run. I wasn't close enough to him to pull off any kind of move. Damien was almost actually close enough to me in the Z4 to pull off a move on me, but in the end I was able to maintain my position, get a little bit closer to GT7 player, and I do think with one more lap I could have potentially passed him. But either way, this is a wild combination, and of course very much suited to the meta car. And even though this car isn't great on pace by itself, it is a good anti-meta car. The anti-meta car being the car that can defeat the meta, not necessarily a car that's just really good that isn't the meta. And I think that's a really important distinction to make this week. Either way, it's been a lot of fun researching what cars to use, but if you think about it, taking out the Ford GT would actually make the entire class really close, at least when it comes to this track. So it's kind of cool seeing a little bit of progress in the BOP for the Group 3s. As always, I very much appreciate you watching my videos. If you haven't done so yet, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for even more Gran Turismo 7 and IRL content. Thank you.